The path to preparing the perfect steak begins well before it arrives in your kitchen and continues even after you take it off the grill. Here are the secrets all home chefs need to know. While it might not necessarily be pleasant to think about, a steak started as a cow that had a life before it made its way to your plate. If a cow grazes on pasture for its entire life, then its body will naturally contain more omega-3 fatty acids, which have a gamey flavor. How active and how old a cow is also impacts texture, as active muscles build up collagen, which is tough to chew. Additionally, added hormones also result in tougher meat, as they affect muscle development. If you really want to know as much as possible about how a cow's life affected your steak, you'll have to do some extra legwork. According to Max Greb, who goes by Max the Meat Guy on social media, beware of labels like grass-fed, as grocery stores often fail to disclose the full truth. The cow may have been grass-fed for some of its life, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was grass-fed the entirety of its life. Always ask the butcher or check the label to make sure the steak is 100% grass-fed and grass-finished. As it turns out, there's such a thing as a too fresh steak. When it comes to most food, fresher is infinitely better, but that's actually not the case with beef cattle. If you're familiar with the concept of rigor mortis, then you should be able to understand what's going on here.
Rigor mortis, girl! It was rigor mortis, girl!
About 24 hours after a cow is butchered, rigor mortis occurs, which is also the case with human beings. To put it simply, rigor mortis is a chemical change that causes a muscle to stiffen. A stiff muscle is a tough muscle, and not one that's particularly ideal for eating. It takes a minimum of 5 days for the stiffening effect to begin to wane. If you're a meat lover, then you've probably heard the very basic advice that more marbling equals a good steak. However, it's a bit more complex than that. Picking a good steak also has to do with acids and fats, and marbling covers both of those. Marbling is technically fat, and as Max Greb explains, marbling is the flecks of white intramuscular fat within the steak itself. More marbling equals more flavor and juiciness. Furthermore, some steaks with more marbling also have more acid content, like oleic acid, which is often connected to desirable flavors. A steak with more oleic acid might be a cut that's considered more flavorful, like a ribeye. And how much acid, fat, and marbling a steak contains can be traced back to how the cow was raised. If you know even just a little bit about steak science, then you've probably heard of the Maillard reaction. As Max Greb explains it, if you've ever tasted a steak with a nice char, you know how important that crispy crust is for flavor. This caramelization is achieved through the Maillard reaction, which only starts to occur past 300 degrees Fahrenheit. This is why steamed food can never develop a flavorful crust. The Maillard reaction occurs when amino acids and sugars undergo a chemical reaction when they reach a certain temperature. This produces new molecules that are directly responsible for the charred, caramelized flavor on steak, or any food that's browned. If you're preparing a steak at home, you might choose to marinate it for a few hours or overnight before cooking to create a more flavorful, more tender cut of meat. However, you're probably not going to do any steak aging at home. But from a purely scientific standpoint, aging and marinating aren't that different, as they actually serve the same function. Both marinating and aging call upon chemical processes to tenderize a cut of meat. In aging, over a short period of time, enzymes, fats, and bacteria begin to change within the meat, breaking down collagen and muscle, which makes for a more tender steak. Marinating does the same work, just over an even shorter time period. When you marinate a steak, you add in some extra helpers, like vinegar or fruit juice, to speed up the collagen and muscle breakdown.
You let that sink in.
Perhaps you've heard the advice that you should let a thawed steak sit on the counter until it comes to room temperature before cooking it. But some experts say this is unnecessary. According to Max Greb, this is probably the most controversial steak question there is. While many chefs swear by this, I believe it is not necessary. I've run several tests with very minimal difference in results. The bottom line is, it doesn't hurt, but likely won't make a noticeable difference. One case study published by an engineer on Medium found that if you take a steak with 75% water content at an average refrigerated temperature while using a typical gas burner, then you can cook a steak from refrigerated to finished in 12 minutes. Cooking another steak from room temperature to the same degree of doneness only takes 10 minutes. Thus, according to these results, you can get the same results from either method with only a 2-minute difference in cooking time. Temperature also impacts how a steak appears. Just how important that is depends on who you ask. If you want a steak that's the same color all the way through, with no weird lines on the inside, then you should use the reverse searing technique. According to Max Greb, this works particularly well for thicker steaks. Start by slowly letting your steak come up to your target internal temperature in a low-temp oven, smoker, or grill about 250 degrees Fahrenheit. If using a grill, create a hot zone and a cool zone. To do this, only turn on the burners on one side on a gas grill, or pour your hot coals on only one side of a charcoal grill. Once the steak reaches its target doneness, let it rest for about 10 minutes, then sear it over extremely high heat on a grill or cast iron. By cooking with low heat to start, the steak will have a perfect edge-to-edge pink interior, and you will avoid the dreaded gray band. While you don't necessarily need to let your steak rest on the countertop before cooking, you should definitely let it rest after it's finished cooking. This is due to a process known as carryover cooking, which ensures that you don't overcook your steak and that it's instead as juicy as possible. When you remove a steak from the grill or turn off the burner, it obviously doesn't magically cool to room temperature instantly. Until all of the heat dissipates, the steak continues to cook. Therefore, you want to remove it from heat slightly before it's fully done. And while it rests, the steak will also be redistributing its juices.
You like the juice, eh?
During the cooking process, the water content within the steak pools near its exterior. As the steak cools, that moisture redistributes, resulting in a juicy interior all the way through. Max Greb advises that thin steaks should rest on the cutting board for about 5 to 7 minutes before slicing, while thicker steaks should wait 10 to 15 minutes. It's important to note that carryover cooking isn't an exact science, as environmental factors impact how and to what degree it occurs. A range of factors can influence how much the internal temperature of steak rises during carryover cooking, including the temperature and humidity in the room, as well as airflow. Factors about the steak itself that can play a part in carryover cooking include its thermal mass, shape, and surface area. On average, carryover cooking raises the internal temperature of steak by between 3 and 6 degrees Fahrenheit. If you've ever seen a steak in the grocery store with a little gray-brown tint to it, you may have assumed that it had gone bad. But the truth is that this could very well be a perfectly good steak. That odd hue was most likely caused by oxidation, and it's nothing to worry about. According to Max Greb, sometimes meat turns slightly grayish. This is only due to the meat being exposed to oxygen. Often, you will find perfectly good steaks at a huge discount due to this discoloration, which has zero impact on taste. The United States Department of Agriculture also notes that beef stored in a refrigerator or similar environment may experience oxidation. However, if you have beef that's been in extended storage, like the freezer, and it turns brown, that could be a sign of spoilage.
Ow!
If you're a culinary novice, then you'll probably prefer a steak that's particularly easy to cook. If so, you should reach for one with a high fat content. According to Max Greb, the fattier the cut, the easier and more foolproof to cook. A ribeye, for example, is rich and fatty, and even if you overcook it, it probably won't dry out, thanks to the marbling. Compare that to the less fatty filet mignon, which will be about as dry as leather even when overcooked by just 30 seconds. If filet or ribeye are too expensive for you, then there are other reliable cuts like flat iron, Denver, outside skirt steak, hanger, and flap steak, which newbie cooks should be able to handle. There's a fine line you have to walk when it comes to flipping your steak. It all depends on the muscle fibers and water content, as well as the Maillard reaction. You don't want to flip it just once, and you also don't want to flip it too late either. According to Max Greb, flipping frequently allows even contact with the heat source and significantly more even cooking. However, it's important to only start flipping once the crust has started to set. Immediately flipping a steak can make the seasoning start to fall off. A good rule of thumb is to let the steak sear for 2 minutes on both sides, then start flipping every 30 seconds. Home cooks should flip steaks about a third of the way while cooking because the muscle fibers contract and push the water content around the steak as it heats up. Flipping a steak a third of the way into the process also ensures that the water content doesn't pool on one side, which would cool the steak and then require a longer cooking time.
What the flip, man?
Some carnivores swear that a rare steak simply tastes better and that a well-done steak has no flavor at all, while others insist that anything that bleeds has no place on their plate. Whatever your preferences are, science has the explanation. A rare steak hasn't been heated through enough for the fatty acids to break down. As those fatty acids break down while cooking, they create some of the characteristic steak flavors. Once you begin heating the steak a little bit longer, more flavors are produced. However, if you heat a steak longer than that, some of those flavors dissipate as compounds break down and emerge. While you probably want to cook your steak long enough that the Maillard reaction takes effect, once that reaction runs its course, burning begins. So how you order your steak could very well indicate that you prefer the flavors of certain beef compounds more than others. Another common meaty misconception is that if you've seared a steak, you've essentially sealed it, preventing any moisture from leaking out, at least until you pierce the steak's exterior. However, this isn't the case. Rather, it's more likely that you just think you've sealed the steak by searing because you're cooking at such a high temperature that any moisture that leaks out evaporates quickly. When you examine a raw versus seared steak under a microscope, it's clear that moisture can pass through the steak's exterior just as easily after the steak has been seared compared to when it's raw. When a steak sizzles, water is coming out and immediately evaporating. When you remove the steak from heat, that liquid will then pool, whether or not the steak is seared. This is because the high heat has been removed, and there's nothing to make the liquid evaporate. So don't worry about searing a steak in order to seal in the juices. Instead, just rely on searing for flavor.